Answer that question for you guys. Oh, thank you. To answer that question for you guys, just to kind of give you a bit more about my background, I have been working as an English teacher for about a decade now. I've worked on different continents with adults, children, beginners, young learners, kind of a good variety. And additionally, I've worked with a lot of business professionals as well. And business English classes are often designed in a way to help you succeed in business. But this is something that I actually kind of question at times. So, for example, I've worked with HR representatives on sales skills. I've worked with marketing professionals on how to give an interview. So these type of activities are found in many business English courses. But from my perspective, while these activities might help you develop your English language skills, they're not going to be essential skills that you need to succeed in your current role. So, kind of, in fact, I believe that, business English courses are not necessarily reflective of the real needs of many professionals. So, this was an idea that I kept in mind for quite some time. And I began to think of how beneficial it would be to create a curriculum that is designed for the specific needs of certain professionals. Then I happened to start teaching a student who was a data scientist. So, as I learned a little bit more about his profession, it became clear to me what skills were needed to succeed in the field. He needed to be able to simplify difficult concepts or discuss data science concepts in a way that others would understand. He needed to be able to tell great stories, and he needed to present his work confidently. So these are kind of the essential skills that are very relevant to many data professionals. So I got to work designing classes to fit his needs. And as we progressed, I learned more and more about the industry, and I began to see the potential of the field and ultimately decided to commit myself to helping my clients develop English communication skills that are specific to their industry. So I have since created a curriculum that focuses on these three skills: simplifying difficult concepts, storytelling, and presenting your results to help data professionals improve their communication skills. And what I enjoy most about this right now is that these are skills that clients can apply right away. And that is kind of the key difference between maybe a general business English class and what I do, because you can use these day one. So that's kind of just a little bit about how I entered into the field. But just to kind of give you a brief overview of, what we'll talk about today. So we're going to look at two key areas. First, we're going to look at how you can simplify difficult concepts. And I'll aim to answer a couple of key questions with this aspect. First, how does your language choice help you, or how can your language choices help you explain challenging concepts? And then additionally, we'll look at how you can use examples effectively. And then after we take a look at that aspect, we'll move on to storytelling and discuss how can you transform data into an engaging story, and look at kind of the key aspects of any good story, which would be a conflict, characters, and a conclusion. Since I'm a language teacher, I'm hoping to make this a little bit interactive. So I hope to get some of you involved throughout the course. You'll have some opportunities to practice some of these language skills. All right, so first, let's jump in and look at simplifying difficult concepts. So, kind of just to begin with an analogy, I'd like for those of you that own a car, I'd like you to think, why do you trust your mechanic? So imagine you take your car to a mechanic after hearing a loud rattle or seeing your check engine light turn on. After taking a look at your car, the mechanic calls you and explains the problem in a way that only other mechanics would understand. They use lots of technical language and discuss parts you've never heard of. So you're kind of completely unsure what this part does, what happened to cause this issue, and what will happen if you don't fix it. All you really know is that it's going to cost you a lot of money. So essentially, the mechanic has failed to communicate effectively with you. For those of you who have a trusted mechanic, it's likely that they have excellent communication skills. When you enter a shop, you know they'll be able to explain any potential issues in a clear way. They'll explain what happened and what can be done to solve the problem. So this situation is actually quite similar to what I think a lot of data professionals encounter. So having the ability to discuss your work with anyone is vital. It's a differentiating skill. It makes you both approachable and an indispensable part of an organization. But what's best is this is a skill that you can learn. Great communicators essentially have a formula for discussing complex topics. So how does your language choice influence your audience? So when we kind of use technical language too quickly, or go too in depth too soon, your audience is going to build what I refer to as a communication wall. They'll assume they are not able to understand this challenging topic. So for example, if I use the you know, dictionary definition of regression. Linear regression is a linear approach to modeling the relationship between, a scalar response and one or more explanatory variables. Boom, you're going to hit that wall. Your audience is going to stop listening to that explanation just because it's immediately above their head. So how can we kind of address this issue is we want to choose our language carefully to tear down these communication walls. And here's how you can do that. So first, things to avoid. Avoid beginning with just technical language or using jargon, which would be industry specific terms. Additionally, avoid just assuming that they're following you. What we want to do instead is first begin with softening language. So softening language is, words or phrases that will prime your audience for a technical explanation. You can use phrases like, if you've ever, if you know how this works. Let me give you a clear example. And this language is vital because it shows your audience that you understand their situation. You know that this topic may be challenging, but you are already demonstrating that you have the communication skills needed to explain it in a clear way. Next, we can then introduce a relatable example. And this is, one of the most effective approaches. By choosing something your audience is familiar with, they're going to be very receptive of your talk. And then finally, end with a summary by going over the details one more time. And this will just ensure that when your audience leaves, they'll have the ability to explain this topic to someone else. And this is your true sign of success. So now I'd like to take a look at a little example of this and kind of answer the question, how can we explain regression using an example? So the Coursera IBM Data Science Certificate, what is data science, has what I would refer to as kind of a perfect explanation of regression. They use softening language, a clear example, and a summary. So I'm going to play an audio clip from the course, and I just want you to pay attention to how he uses the concepts and language we've just discussed. So let me get that started.
Forget about it. Let me explain regression in the simplest possible terms. If you have ever taken a cab ride, a taxi ride, you understand regression. Here's how it works. The moment you sit in a cab, you see that there's a fixed amount there. It says $2.50. Whether the cab moves or you get off, this is what you owe to the driver. The moment you step into a cab, that's a constant. You have to pay that amount if you have stepped into a cab. Then as it starts moving, for every meter or 100 meters, the fare increases by a certain amount. So there's a fraction, there's a relationship between distance and the amount you would pay above and beyond that constant. And if you're not moving and you're stuck in traffic, then every additional minute you have to pay more. So as the minutes increase, your fare increases. As the distance increases, your fare increases. And while all this is happening, you've already paid a base fare, which is the constant. This is what regression is. Regression tells you what the base fare is and what is the relationship between time and the fare you have paid and the distance you've traveled and the fare you've paid. Because in the absence of knowing those relationships and just knowing how much people traveled for and how much they paid, regression allows you to compute that constant that you didn't know it was 250, and it would compute the relationship between the fare and the distance and the fare and the time. That's a regression.
Great. All right. So as you can kind of see, that's a very good explanation. He used language choices extremely well. He began with softening language and an example. He said, let me explain regression in the simplest possible terms. If you have ever taken a taxi ride, you understand regression. This type of language will immediately open your audience to what you're going to say next. They will believe that you are going to be able to explain this concept in a clear way. Additionally, he chose a very relatable example. Pretty much everyone in the world has taken a taxi, and he connected both the constant and the variable with examples within that framework. And then he ended with a summary. This is what regression is, and gave a very clear kind of summary one more time. So that's kind of the overarching way of how you can kind of make those language choices when trying to explain some technical concepts. So I would like to practice a little bit more. As this is a webinar on communication, I am looking for, maybe one person or two people who would like to try to explain classification using an example. So if there's anyone who is brave and would like to give it a shot, I would love to hear it. Otherwise, I'll have to make Alexey do it. Let's see. I don't think we have any brave souls, Alexey.
Okay.
Good. All right. So I'm going to put you on the spot and see if you can kind of follow that similar approach to try to explain classification using an example.
Okay. So just to recap first, like start with the softening language.
The softening language, if you've ever, let me give you a clear example. Something along those lines, and then give your example and end, with a short summary.
So if you see how a child learns, then you can understand classification. Imagine a child is growing up and the kid wants to understand, and the kid is learning to distinguish between cats and dogs and different animals. And then they can ask their parents, hey, what is on this picture? Is it a cat or is it a dog? And then the parent would answer. And then once again, multiple times, is it a cat or is it a dog? And then from that, the child will generalize and understand, okay, a cat is an animal with a certain shape of ears, a certain shape of face, and then how it's called, like whiskers.
Yeah, whiskers. Yeah.
Yes. So dogs don't do that, don't have that, and then for dogs the ears are usually floppy, so they're different. And then just learning at examples, they will be able to understand that and generalize. And then next time they see on the street an animal, which is a cat or a dog, they will be able to say, okay, this is a dog because of these reasons. So the parents wouldn't tell them explicitly what are the different characteristics of an animal. Kids will just learn themselves from the pictures. And this is how classification works. You show many different pictures to an algorithm without telling what exactly to look at. You just tell that this is an image of a dog, this is an image of a cat. And then the algorithm by looking at many different images, starts to understand what kind of features, what kind of characteristics lead to describe a cat, describe a dog. And then from that, next time they see a picture of an animal, the algorithm will be able to tell which animal it is. So in short, regression, in summary, regression classification is um, a process where you show an algorithm many different pictures of animals, and then it learns by just looking at them.
I think that's pretty good, Alexey. Good.
Okay.
I like that you used, the softening language at the beginning. If you've ever seen a child play, you understand classification. Good. Everyone in the world has seen a child play at one time and kind of see how the children learn. And you provided a very clear example, cats and dogs, and how they're able to kind of differentiate between each one of those. You tied it back with a clear summary at the end as well. And that's essentially the language features you want to use. Have you used that approach in the past to explain classification to someone, or did you just kind of come up with that?
Well, I did use this example in one of
Okay.
the talks. Yeah, I
Hmm.
didn't structure it in this way. That's why
Yeah.
it was a bit difficult to me. But yeah, that wasn't something I came up on the spot.
Okay. No, but I think with the way you structured it, it made it very clear. So I think that was excellent. All right, great. Thank you, Alexei. So let's jump back in here. Good. So next, good. I want to turn to storytelling. So storytelling is a bit of a buzzword in data-related fields. Everyone talks about it, but using it, however, is not always clear. Storytelling, however, is a data professional's kind of Swiss Army knife. It allows you to engage your audience, simplify complex processes, and motivate action. So recently, I met a client who had been working in the field for several years. He told me that he lacked confidence when presenting his work. He had worked very hard on developing a new model to solve a key business problem. He was always really excited about his machine learning projects because he understood their power. Unfortunately, his colleagues didn't share his excitement. So he began to kind of question himself. Were his projects worthless? Was he not good at his job? What was the problem? When I inquired about how he presented his work, he mentioned his process. He would simply state the problem, then give an in depth explanation of his work, and finally give his recommendation. So this is a pretty straightforward and common approach, but it is also the reason why his work didn't lead to excitement. He was unable to turn his findings into a story or a narrative that would engage the audience by connecting them to the problem. And this is what makes storytelling so powerful, is that it connects the audience with the problem, and then they have the ability to make a decision to solve this problem. So how do we find an engaging narrative? So to kind of find a narrative, you must first understand what makes a good story. So if you think about, your favorite book or movie, it begins by introducing, characters in the setting. The characters then face a problem. They have a conflict that must be solved, and they must overcome this problem. And then we process through the story. They're trying to overcome, but it ends with a resolution. The conflict is resolved, the character situation has improved. So while there are many, different storytelling frameworks, on the most basic level, stories have three key parts: characters, conflict, and a conclusion. Now, to find the kind of find a narrative, the easiest starting point in a business sense is just by identifying the conflict. So essentially, any type of machine learning project is designed to solve a problem. So we can ask ourselves a few key questions. What is the problem we are trying to solve? And additionally, why is this an important problem to solve? And once we've identified that conflict, we can then move on to look at the characters or the setting. So when we're kind of identifying our characters, we can ask ourselves a few key questions as well. First, who is affected by the conflict or this problem? Why do they want this problem solved? And how will their situation improve when it is solved? And then finally, we can move on to the conclusion. And the key question here is, how does your knowledge resolve the conflict for the characters? So I kind of like to look at, data scientists as individuals who are able to kind of identify and solve problems in creative ways that previously were impossible to do. So once we've identified some of these different aspects of our narrative, we're going to need to put the elements together in an engaging way. So our progression would be first, looking at our introduction. And during the introduction, we want to highlight the problem and who is affected by it. Additionally, we really want to hook our audience at this point. And additionally, the other aspect would be, the best stories encourage the audience to kind of discover or uncover the problem themselves. So if you kind of think back to that movie example, any good film starts with an expose on the situation, and then a conflict is introduced. And during this period, you identify the problem yourself. Then we move on to the body where we expand on the issue. We highlight your knowledge. You can describe your methodology or the model you've built and introduce what can be done to solve the problem. And then our conclusion should resolve the conflict, and it should demonstrate why your expertise is vital. I want to take a look at a simple example of this using demand forecasting at a shoe store as an example. We could directly state the problem. If our company is Shoes R Us, we could say, we do not have enough stock of certain items at certain times. Luckily, demand forecasting models can mitigate this problem. This, however, kind of lacks engagement. So how do we engage our audience? So we'll want to use some form of hook. And this often comes in the form of either interesting facts or motifs. And at this point, we should introduce our audience to the conflict and the characters as clearly as possible. And then from this hook, we can build a narrative that will motivate our audience to act. So here's a potential kind of introduction and hook if we're kind of using that shoe store example. So I might start by saying, so I don't buy shoes very often, but there's something that I'm willing to spend money on. Last year, my beloved pair of Clark's desert boots reached the end of their life. It was unfortunate timing as they're my go-to shoe, and I had big weekend plans. So of course, I ran to the nearest Shoes R Us. I arrived and was immediately greeted by a helpful assistant named Paul. I told Paul what I was looking for: brown, Clark, desert boots, size 10. Paul went to the back and returned empty-handed. I received the dreaded, sorry, we're out of stock, but we have this. I told Paul, sorry, I'm not interested. I knew I didn't want any of the alternative options, so I left the store and was able to find what I wanted at a competitor down the street. Shoes R Us lost out on a sale that cost over $120. As the customer, I lost out on time and had to reevaluate my loyalty to the company. Paul lost out on his commission. So this situation can lead to decreased customer loyalty, employee turnover, and lost revenue. Now, this is a problem that isn't unique. Given the vast stocks that we must have at every Shoes R Us location, it will certainly happen from time to time. But how can we solve this issue? Luckily, we can create machine learning models that will help us predict the demand for each style and size at all of our retail locations across the country. Here's how it works. So that would be kind of my introduction. We then go on to, explain the issue more in depth. And At that point, after we have that introduction, we'll go to our body where we expand. And this will be more that functional report when you're really detailing what you've been working on, the exact figures that you've done, and how you're going to potentially deploy this model. So you're at this point introducing potential resolutions. And then we'll get to our conclusion. And one of my favorite techniques for a conclusion is to highlight how things will be different for the characters or various stakeholders in our story. So using that example I just kind of discussed, I could mention how customers like myself would have increased loyalty, how employees like Paul will make more money and likely be happier in the process or more willing to stay. And the company, Shoes R Us, will see increased sales. So your story in essence has first highlighted, the problem in depth during our introduction. Then you showed how your knowledge and your products can resolve the issue. And then you finished by describing how the situation will change. And finishing by highlighting an ideal situation is incredibly motivating, especially if you've done a good job highlighting the issue. So it's likely your audience wants to solve this problem. And the information you've presented is the bridge between the current situation and an ideal one. And they are the ones who have the decision-making ability to solve this issue. So that's kind of a hypothetical example. But once again, I would love to discuss some projects that you guys are working on. So if someone has or is willing to volunteer, just to kind of have a brief discussion and go through something specific you're working on, and we'll just discuss, the potential characters, conflict, and conclusion. So is there anyone who has a certain product that they're looking to kind of find a narrative for at the moment? Maybe not.
Well, I can volunteer then.
Okay, well, yes, maybe I'll have to have you volunteer there, Alexey, one more time.
Actually, so there is a message in chat in Zoom
Mhm.
that Carol wrote that my issue is to get leadership to notice the updates on science policy.
Okay.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah, so getting the leadership to notice the updates on the science policy. So Carol, what is kind of the overall problem you're trying to solve? So
Okay.
the science budget is really important. So I guess, Carol, the question I would be asking with that one, when you're trying to find the narrative with that, is what problems is the AI able to solve for the organization? Because that would kind of be our starting point in finding that narrative.
So maybe I read to make it a bit more interactive. So
Yeah.
what Carol wrote that, I'll read it from the beginning. So
Mm-hmm.
the issue is to get leadership to notice the updates on science policy. The science budget is really important, but they do not understand how AI and grants impact research. So I read the legislation every day. I develop a report. I gather all the AI and research bills and present. They know machine learning, data science. They know that machine learning and data science is important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that one, what I would say is, obviously, it seems like the problem you're trying to overcome is getting them to notice, how AI and grants impact research. So, kind of your clear conflict in that one would be potentially, a situation where research is not getting solved because of this lack of funding for the grants. And then once we've identified this aspect of that, we'll go on to, look at who's affected by this situation. Once we kind of take a look at it, it's kind of from my perspective, on a very obviously brief overview, it seems like, the research institutes are probably the most likely individuals who are affected by this situation. And then what you would do, if I understand what you're building would be, is it essentially kind of like a AI pipeline where you're gathering the bills and then just presenting that? Is that kind of the actual machine learning aspect? Yes. Okay. So if that would be the aspect, with that, what you could potentially do, Carol, is use storytelling to highlight kind of the problems that these research institutes are facing because of a lack of funding. So we build on that, and we could use interesting facts. What have these research institutes been able to solve in the past, given their limited budget? Or using a motif. Maybe you talk about one person in the organization and kind of the problems they are facing. Then your knowledge should be, oh, so I'm looking at that. So then your knowledge would be good, kind of making sure that they understand the importance of the funding and the machine learning models that you're using to get that funding. And then your conclusion would be kind of looking at that hypothetical situation of what will happen if this problem is resolved. If these research teams are getting the funding that they need and that they deserve, what type of work will they be able to accomplish? And that's where you're kind of building that bridge. So you're showing this problem, they are not able to accomplish this type of work. The ideal situation, what they'll be able to do with the proper amount of funding, and then you are the bridge between those aspects. So hopefully that was kind of clear to you, Carol, and could be potentially useful in the future. Good. If there's anyone else who has any type of problem, but I would be happy to kind of discuss those aspects as well.
Carol is saying thank you.
No, no problem, Carol. Happy to help. So Alexey, do you have a problem that you're currently working on?
Yeah, we can talk about it. So let's say, so I work at a place, at a website with online classifieds platform. So it's like Craigslist or eBay, like basically where you go and sell things. And sometimes sellers come to the platform, they create a listing, they sell the thing, let's say iPhone, they sell the iPhone, but they forget to update the listing. So basically it's still there, it's still active. People still try to reach out the seller, ask, hey, can I buy your iPhone? But the iPhone is already gone. So what we want to do is to detect these kind of listings and make sure, like maybe ask the seller, hey, it seems like you've sold the item. Can you please deactivate it or do something like that?
Yep, absolutely. So kind of that obviously seems like a very key business problem for OLX, but why do you think this problem is important?
Yeah, so it creates frustration for users, like buyers, for example. They want to, like they found the iPhone of their dreams for the price they want in the location close to them. They reach out to the seller, hey, I want to buy your iPhone, and sorry, it's sold, or even no response at all. And then for the
Exactly.
sellers also, because they're, maybe they are spammed with, not spammed, but like many people write to them and they're just annoyed. They don't reply.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would think is kind of the more engaging character in that situation would probably be the end user or the people who are trying to buy the products, mainly because the sellers who kind of leave those listings are part of the problem with that. Good. And then essentially, how can your insight or the models you're building help resolve the conflict for those characters?
Well, we can use different signals, like different interactions with the platform. to understand that this item is probably sold already,
Yeah.
and then
Hmm.
ask the seller to uh, ask them, hey, it seems like you've sold the item. Can you please deactivate it?
Hmm.
So engage with the seller, ask first whether they sold it or not, and then if it's the case, ask them to remove it from the platform.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So something like that to me, in terms of kind of storytelling, you could use kind of that classic motif like I was using kind of before, where you're putting yourself in the shoes of an individual who's searching for the perfect iPhone, good, and then it leads to, obviously frustration. Then we might paint the picture of, what this model can do to kind of alleviate that for them and show that ideal situation. But there are also other approaches you can use. You don't always have to use just that motif example. You could use interesting facts as well, or kind of statistics. So for example, every day there are this many dead listings existing on OLX, and this many users are investigating these dead listings. So that's not necessarily using a specific motif, but you're still introducing the conflict and the characters that are being affected by it. And then once again, you would then transition to the center or your body of your talk, where you're once again introducing this, algorithm to help kind of solve this problem. And you're ending with this idealized situation. Well, how would these interesting facts or figures be different? How do you estimate your model changing the situation? So that could be a slightly different approach, but you're still following that storytelling framework. Good. Does that kind of make sense in terms of a narrative, Alexey?
It definitely does. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect. Great. Good. Kind of just looking at a couple of those. Good. Thanks both Carol and Alexey for sharing that a little bit. Good. So let me share my screen with you again. Good. Just kind of, wrapping up here. So kind of, there are certainly other communication skills that data professionals must master, but kind of beginning with the ability to, simplify difficult concepts and tell engaging stories is vital. Having these skills will ensure you can communicate effectively with any audience while also discussing your work in an engaging way. So these type of skills are essentially, what separate many within the field. And I believe that it is vital for all data professionals to match their communication skills with their analytical abilities. So if these are, kind of skills that you're looking to further develop, please get in touch with me. You can reach me either on LinkedIn, like my full name is David Gates, or my email, which is just info@accentswelcome.com, or you can just look at booking a free strategy session directly from my website, which would be accentwelcomes.com, and then the data science aspect. So currently I focus mainly on one-on-one classes, but I am going to be introducing group classes here as well. But both of these types of lessons will allow you to kind of hone some of your communication skills. Now, I would love to answer any questions any of you have regarding any other aspects of communication that you are struggling with. Were there any
So
questions written in the kind of chat box there, Alexey?
let me share my screen with Slido. And
Okay.
then, so there are questions like I don't see the slides.
Okay.
They will become available, right?
Were you able to see the slides?
Yeah.
You did. Okay. Okay. I was making sure. Okay.
Yeah. So while people are coming up with questions, I do have a question
Yeah.
from me. So what is your opinion about accents? So I myself, English is not my native language, and sometimes I think, okay, my Russian accent maybe is too strong. Uh, in your opinion, does it like, is it like does it hurt perception, like having an accent like that is not necessarily like a native
No,
accent?
so that's actually kind of part of the inspiration for why I'm called Accents Welcome, because I believe that accents are okay. In terms of kind of my actual teaching approach, I use what I refer to, or what's known as in kind of research circles, as English as a lingua franca or English as a global language. And what that aspect does in terms of kind of English ability is it focuses on what leads to miscommunication, what makes it hard for people to understand you. And actually, there's been a lot of kind of research collected in this area. There's something called voice data, which is about over 1 million spoken words that were analyzed, and they looked at what caused issues in terms of comprehensibility. And with accents, there are a few key aspects of it. Usually it's related to mainly if you're using consonants incorrectly and if you're using vowel length incorrectly. And those are going to be the couple aspects that make it hard for individuals to understand you. But it doesn't mean that you can't keep your accent or you have to change it and sound like a native speaker. That is not required to be a successful communicator. Yeah,
Okay.
make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
So we have a question from the audience. Um, so can you explain how to determine if a visualization is too complicated for non-text to understand?
Um, s- that is a good question. So with that, it's it really does depend on your audience with that one. And this is where kind of those language skills are going to kind of come into play. And even when a visualization is very complicated, I, for one, believe that you should still have the ability to explain this in a simple and effective way. And if the visualization is extremely complex, you might need to break it down a little bit more for them and kind of start with specific use cases. And if you can kind of link something like qualitative data to quantitative data and give a specific example of, what is going on at each one of these points, that could be a useful approach. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have another question. What approach would work to convince a type of audience who are skeptical or not already on board, open-minded, possibly due to a certain bias?
Yep. So that's where a lot of your persuasive language is going to come into play. And that would be another area that I kind of focus on with that. And there are many examples of how you can use persuasive language effectively. But kind of taking it back to the storytelling, I think the storytelling is going to be one of your most powerful persuasive techniques. So if you're trying to convince an audience who are skeptical or not necessarily on board, what you will probably need to do is spend more time highlighting the problem during your introduction. And that's kind of the difference. If you have an audience that is already completely on board with anything you're building, you probably don't need to spend a lot of time, really going in depth with all of these different characters and how they're affected by the problem. But if they're quite skeptical, then you should list several different characters or stakeholders who are affected by the issue. So if I was kind of going back to my shoes R Us example, I might spend more time highlighting, how this has affected employee turnover, lost commission, how that is affecting our job overall, how this is affecting our sales. So I might spend more time kind of introducing those aspects and, how this is affecting customer kind of preferences of our organization. So if you have a very skeptical audience, you need to spend more time on that aspect. And then once again, you become the bridge to solve that problem. And then you're giving that very ideal situation for the audience. You've spent a good amount of time convincing them that this problem is real, you know how to solve it, and then painting that picture of what they want the situation to look like afterwards. So if you're using storytelling in that sense, that's what I would recommend. More time highlighting the problem and more time spent on that ideal situation.
Yes, thank you. So I have another question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I understand the importance of stories. What is difficult for me personally is coming up with these stories. How do I uh, do this? Where do I get inspiration?
I like to, when I'm trying to think of the stories in terms of kind of that inspiration, it's trying to put yourself in those characters' shoes is essentially the way I always try to frame it. And if you can kind of come up with something that is both relatable and something that you've experienced before, that would be where that narrative falls into place. So once you've kind of identified the conflict, then the characters, and if you're looking for inspiration, think about putting yourself in the character's shoes. Why is this problem so frustrating to them? And then trying to come up with a narrative or potentially a short story about them facing this obstacle and how frustrating it is before transitioning to your aspects where you're giving kind of that more formal approach.
Okay, makes sense.
Yep.
Um, on a related note, like stories are very powerful, but then at the end, what I also quite often hear, yeah, stories are cool, but like we need to see the data, like how important this problem is. So when is the right moment to actually go from a story, like from an anecdote, to data, to statistics? Should it be somehow incorporated maybe in a story? I think you hinted at that at some point, like how to structure the story in a way that it includes both things. Like
Yeah, so of course there are many different frameworks that you could use there with that. So some people will really kind of, show that data right away to someone and then kind of fill in that motif aspects to kind of motivate action towards the end. And that could be a useful approach. I think the most straightforward approach is first using that storytelling to highlight the problem, and then what that allows you to do is get your audience engaged. And that's what makes storytelling so powerful is your audience then cares about the problem. And once you reach that point, that is when you can start to uncover your data. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to spend 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, kind of identifying the problem. Some audiences are already, like we kind of mentioned before, are already going to be receptive to this. So you might only spend 30 seconds on talking about that problem, and then you transition to the data. So kind of the amount and how much or when you incorporate your data, I would say depends a bit on your audience and their receptiveness to this idea. If your goal is to persuade them, if they're not on board already, like you said, you're going to need to spend more time. If your goal is simply to inform them, then you can be a bit more straightforward with that. And in those situations, I would recommend kind of jumping into facts and figures right away, pulling maybe things from your data that will be of interest to them before transitioning to kind of the meat of that presentation.
makes total sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So unless maybe let's wait for a bit.
I have
Sorry.
a question if we have time.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah, so it seems like when you are talking about storytelling, it's like when you try to sell a project, a machine learning project, data science project. Do you have examples of using storytelling when you are going through job interviews, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So with storytelling and job interviews, that actually can also be very, very powerful with that. And what I like to kind of work on with individuals is essentially a success story. So talking about a time where they've done something successfully. So you're still going to kind of follow that similar framework where you're going to look at, your characters, the conflict, and the conclusion. So if you're looking at what you've done in the past or your past experiences, what you might discuss is, first making sure the person you're interviewing with understands the problem that you were facing, that this was a major obstacle for this organization or for this individual, whoever you were solving this problem for, and also highlighting who was affected by the problem. So those are going to be kind of your conflict and your characters in your success story. And then you're going to turn that in where the conclusion is you. where you are the person who was able to solve this problem. You were the reason that this conflict was eliminated. So when you're asked, for example, a question like, what are your greatest strengths? You could use something in an interview to talk about, a specific project you worked on and, what aspect of your strength, whether it was, resourcefulness, your knowledge of a certain type of machine learning product. That could be your strength, and you could simply turn that into a story by really highlighting the problem you were trying to solve and why you were the perfect person to do that.
Great, thanks a lot.
No problem.
Well, unless there are more questions, I think we're approaching the end of this. So
Yeah.
Will you share the slides, David?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'll put them in.
Should I just share
Slack.
them on the Slack channel, Alexey?
Yes.
Okay.
Or you can
Yeah.
send it to me and then I'll share.
Okay. Yeah, I'll probably email it to you after this. I'll be happy to do that.
Yes, and the recording will be available quite soon. Sorry, I didn't start recording immediately. You probably
no
noticed
problem.
that. So I didn't record the introduction at the beginning, but most of the content was recorded. So apologies for
Yes. Right. Yeah, well, I also want to thank everyone for your time. I think it was really valuable, and I hope you guys found some value in it.
Well, I personally did. And looking at the comments in chat, also many people are saying thank you.
Perfect.
And there is actually, no, there are no questions anymore. Okay. Thanks for coming. And yeah, if you have questions to David, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Find me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm happy to kind of discuss your situation. And yeah, if it's these are skills you're looking to improve, certainly get in touch.
Yes. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.